Okay. So, I was really trying to figure out what to say about today, and I came across Phineas Gage. I was going to use him in a completely other presentation regarding science and ethics, and then it just became such an interesting story that I thought it were merits enough just on its own. So quickly, Phineas Gage was a foreman of a construction crew on a railroad back in the 1840s, and he, through an accident, he had a rod blow through his head, through his brain, and through the other side. He lived and underwent some psychological changes. This has become the lore. It's gone down into neurological lore, and every neuroscience class in medical school starts off with Phineas Gage. So here he is, and we can see that even afterwards, he was a fairly handsome man. He looked even proud to be sitting there in this picture. And that's the actual rod that went through his head. So he was in Vermont, and he had designed this tamping rod himself. He was quite innovative, he was quite intelligent, 25 years old at the time. And what they did when they had they were laying down railroad tracks, and what they would do is put dynamite in here. They would bore a hole down into the rock and put dynamite in here, cover it up with sand and dirt to try to contain the thing, and then light the fuse, and it would blow apart the rock. Through some accident, somehow he was distracted as he was working with his tamping rod. Some spark caught, and as he was turning around, he was distracted by his workman. He was actually a foreman in the group. And he turned around. As he did, spark hit, the thing exploded, and it went through his open mouth and through the frontal lobe of his skull. He fell to the ground convulsing, but within a few minutes was able to get up and was talking to his co-workers. They brought him down into the local town in Vermont, and where he went to the doctor and said, well, here, I've got some business for you. So this was then brought to Dr. Harlow, who was not the original doctor. And luckily, in med school, he had seen a brain injury case be treated by one of the chiefs of surgery at his medical school. That patient ultimately died, but through learning some knowledge of how to treat brain injuries, Dr. Harlow was able to tend to Gage. He actually left open areas in the brain for drainage, because he knew that there would be a lot of inflammatory expansion in the tissues in the brain. Indeed, I have a friend of mine who had a terrible brain injury a few years ago, and when I went to visit him in the hospital, he was hooked up to about a dozen or more, 20 IV tubes, and he had a stent in his brain to allow for expansion. So it's a technique that's still used today. About 14 days later, he became septic, and because of luck, where there was some drainage in the sinus cavities, and Harlow's knowledge, he was able to drain quite a bit of pus out of it and treat his fungal infections with crystalline silver nitrate, which was the best they had at that time. He ultimately recovered, and I won't go into all the gory details, but it's fun. At any rate, and this is what he looked like, his skull. This is his actual skull. Harlow maintained connections with the family who had moved to San Francisco by the time that he died. And convinced them to exhume his body and ship this skull to Harvard Medical School, where it continues, where it still is today. You can go there and see it. And you can see, this was a moulage, facial moulage of him. And you can see that the left eye has what we call ptosis. He could not open his left eye and had no vision in his left eye. And a hole through his skull. Neuroscientists have been absolutely obsessed with this over the course of time. And this is there have been several recreations of his brain and where they assume the rod went through, and then recreated that portion of the brainstem. So he went to his parents' home about 10 weeks later. Later on, he was seen at Harvard. He actually went down to Harvard, where the chief of surgery, Dr. Bigelow, saw him, presented him to a meeting of the New England Journal of whatever medicine or something was available at that time, and then he was shown to his medical students as well. He later he went to P.T. Barnum's American Museum. This was not his circus. It was not his traveling circus. Apparently, if I remember Hugh Jackman's movie correctly, before he had the circus, he had his own sort of museum in New York City, and he became a part of it, and he tried to promote himself as a curiosity, tried to make some money off of his misfortune. In 1852, he got himself a job as a stagecoach driver for some company that was opening up in Chile, and went down to Chile, where he worked as a stagecoach driver for about 7 years. He finally came back to San Francisco, where his mother and sister had moved and was cared for by them, and then ultimately died of epilepsy.
How old was he when he died?
36, I believe. Yeah, so he was fairly young. And one of the factors that's attributed to his recovery was the fact that he was so robust when he was 25. He was, by all accounts, in the peak of health. He was very strong, and he was very innovative. I mean, he designed the tamping rod that actually went through his skull, and was one of the best foremen that the company had at that time. So it was because of that he's thought to have did so well. What's interesting was, at that time, there was no knowledge of how the brain functioned in neurology. So this was the first case where damage that could be documented was done to the brain, and then the patient lived with differing personality traits. So it was neurology's first view into the brain and the mind-brain connection. So much has been made of this, and now the problem is that there's a lot of, this was not really well documented. Harlow apparently documented this quite well, but in deference to the family's sensitivities and Gage's sensitivities, he didn't publish his findings until 20 years later, to about 6 or 7 years after Gage died. So he says that during that time, he said his behavior was childish, vacillating. He would come up with all kinds of ideas and then not follow up on them. You know, when what he wanted to have done was done for him so that he could proceed, he then left and didn't do it. He couldn't focus on any one thing for a long period of time. Dr. Bigelow, who was the chief of surgery, didn't see any particular problems with his behavior. All right, thought he was completely fine. So some people are speculating that this could be because of the differences in training for Harlow and Bigelow. Harlow was in the local phrenology society. I don't know too much about it, but it seems to have been one of the early psychological societies, and may have seen more in it than Bigelow, who was a kind of nuts and bolts surgeon, was. And an American physician in Chile wrote that Gage was fully engaged in his work and free of any apparent mental illness. So the general thinking is that this has become lore, and what's happened is it's almost an interesting view into skepticism, because each side of the story has seen in the facts of a validation of their point of view. So that if you think that really not much happened to him afterwards, well then you take Bigelow's account. If you think that this resulted in a wild change in his character, then you take Harlow's account. How bad was it really? We don't really know. The records were sketchy at the time. Was it temporary? Because it certainly seems likely that someone who had all of this happen to him would undergo some personality change for a while, but then he was able to hold a steady job for 7 years in Chile as a stagecoach driver. And if you know anything about stagecoach driving, you're supposed to hold 4 different. Each horse has a different lead, and you're supposed to hold them in the same hand, so that you control each of the horses separately with your fingers. There's an enormous amount of dexterity, an enormous amount of hand-eye coordination is required. So, for at least some point, he had to have been stable. What does this mean? Does this mean that he had an initial damage and that the brain somehow started to heal itself and recover, and he was able to recover a relatively stable life and much of his former personality? We don't know. Does the fact that it went through the frontal lobe mean much? Well, yes, but also it went through other parts of his brain, and much of his brain was destroyed due to infection afterwards. So that was not due to trauma. So we don't know how much of his brain was actually affected. Also, each person's brain is extremely individual, apparently as much as people's faces are, so that one frontal lobe might sit here, one might sit a little bit over to the other side. So there's a difference and a difference in how much gray matter, how much white matter is there. So some studies have said that, well, he lost 4% gray matter, 11% white matter. But this is all pure speculation 100 years after the fact. So we're left with a lot of curiosity. But this was a landmark case in neurology because it was the first time that there could be a connection, direct connection shown between the brain and the mind. I was going to say one other thing. I forget what it was. So anyway, I've kept this presentation short because I wanted to have a robust Q&A. So thank you very much.
You said earlier that you came across him when you wanted to do an ethics presentation. So what were the ethical, if you were going to talk about him during your ethics presentation, what was the ethical issue that you would have brought up?
Well, there are, in my view, I think science can inform ethics. I don't necessarily say it can bring it down to a fine point, but it can inform our ethical decision making. So if this really did change his personality, changing his brain, change his personality, well, clearly that would have some ethical implications for mind-body relationship. And there have been other studies. There was a fellow who recently had all of a sudden, for the first time in his life, started watching child pornography. His wife was appalled. turned him into the police, and his wife had a daughter by another man and was afraid for her. And he was ultimately arrested, convicted, and was awaiting sentencing. And then he had a terrible headache just before his sentencing, was brought to a hospital, had an MRI done, and he was found to have a tumor in his frontal lobe. The tumor was removed, and his child pornography desires vanished. He had always been interested in pornography. It was like never child pornography. And then after a period of time, the child pornography desires came back. Went for a second MRI. Another tumor, the tumor was found to have come back. They took it out again, and that went away. So clearly there's some relationship between behavior and physical characteristics of the mind. Exactly how we don't know yet. And in fact, the brain cells, personality is not geared by any one particular neuron, but as the current understanding is that it has to be a whole network of neurons, and it's that networking of brain cells that actually starts to determine personality. So it's a far more complex thing than we can pin down right now, but this is an early primitive sort of a look into mind-brain relationship.
I was thinking of Brady, Reagan's cabinet minister, who took a .22 caliber shot into his right brain from John Hinckley. And now he was very disabled. He walked with a cane and talked like a child, and was not fun. Could never have been a state program. And I thought, okay, well the right side of the brain is the side that talks, the left side of the brain is. But Gabby Giffords took a heavier caliber bullet in the left side of the brain, and she could talk pretty well. There was a weird thing where she didn't ask questions.
Oh, really?
She eventually started asking questions. But those were kind of similar cases that are quite remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. And each one is very individual. And what they were saying is that if damage to the front part of your brain, the frontal lobe, while possibly more damaging to your personality, is less damaging to your ability to live, because if you were shot in the hindbrain, well, those are your cerebellar functions like breathing, your heartbeat, that sort of thing. So damage to the back part of your brain is actually more deadly than to the front part of your brain. So if you want to change your personality, you would shoot yourself in the front part of your brain. If you really want to end it all, then shoot yourself in the back part of your brain. Yeah. Sure.
You mentioned that one of the doctors was at least interested in phrenology.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, has anyone kind of tried to map some type of the phrenological method that we have onto his interpretation, given, I imagine, the trauma caused some type of skull deformity, right?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, much of his brain case never came back, and while the soft tissue healed over, there was no more skull, no more bone over parts of his brain, and you could actually feel his pulse through his head. I'm sure that phrenology has tried to map that out. In most of the research that I did, which was really cursory, to be honest, none of that was mentioned. None of the phrenological.
So I'm just wondering, like his impishness and maybe the bumps that the phrenologists of old kind of associated with those behaviors kind of matches the change in his structure.
The best the best way I can take it is that phrenology was really an ancient sort of a primitive kind of look at personality, and I don't know of any reputable or major neurological group that uses phrenological means today. So there might have been, but it would have only been a curiosity to see what they came up with. I think you had the question first, and then you should.
I think I remember hearing that one of the Kennedy's daughters had a lobotomy to control her, she was an active person. Was he used as kind of like an example of how to do lobotomy?
It was thought so, but there's no evidence that neuroscience actually used Gage as a prototype for lobotomy. That whatever their reasons were, it didn't have anything to do with Gage. No.
That was exactly the question I was going to ask.
Okay.
I mean, not exactly, but close.
Yeah.
Weren't there unscrupulous people who used phrenology to justify eugenics? And that's one of the reasons.
So, yeah, it's been closely related to eugenics, and the Nazis, measured people's heads. German doctors back in those days measured people's head, the skulls looked at their eyes and could supposedly tell a person's characteristics from that. And also thought they could tell whether someone was Jewish or not because of their facial types. Yeah.
I'm not a scientist, so maybe someone can correct this. My sister works in a brain injury center, and she said that it's like when they get people who attempt suicide and hit them in the frontal lobe, they don't die. They just lose the ability to do higher order thinking. So they'll be like, you want to plan a birthday party, what would you do? And they can't get past the step of buy a gift. It's like they can't think there's invitations to send, they need to get a reservation. It's like they lose that, so they go back to being a child.
Right.
Like in terms of, you can't, like the delayed gratification and like the understanding of steps and how to get there. So she said that's exactly what happens. So when they're talking about erratic and like impatience and stuff like that, she said that's what they see when it's a frontal lobe injury.
Right, so that's fully consistent with what we see.
And so she gets strokes and injuries, but they've had multiple people who had frontal lobe injury specifically. Some were attempted suicides, and they didn't die. It's just they lost the ability to do this sort of step-by-step, let me think of the big picture, and how I plan a party, like a multi-step process that they couldn't do anymore.
And then they're fully depressed because they even tried to kill themselves and failed.
Yeah,
it's a particularly bad situation for them to be in. Yeah, a psychologist friend of mine said that that's a really bad thing. And there's another question? Yeah.
So in your research, do you come across any religious response to this in terms of if someone's personality changed, what does that say for their view on the soul?
Well, there was a lot of that made. I didn't really read it. It wasn't part of my interest, just because that sort of becomes speculation at that point, and I just wanted to stick to the facts. But yes, tons was made of mind-body dichotomy, and whether this is the seat of the soul, and this sort of thing. So it's a huge, huge thing. Well, one other example, I have just a couple more minutes, of brains influencing character is that teenagers have now been found to have a greater density of gray matter, 20% greater density of gray matter on average between the ages of 14 and 18. And then the gray matter starts to come back, density comes back to more normal levels. So this, and teenagers are also, and apparently this is mostly in the frontal lobe of the brain. The fMRI studies are showing this. And this is another example for me that science can inform ethics, because if you're talking about a teenager whose brain is literally not formed yet, and who in one sense is kind of out of their minds already, which is, you take a look at typical teenage behavior, it's very rash, very excessive, very spontaneous. This is the sort of thing that you might expect. And if we're going to treat teenagers as adults when we sentence them for crimes, in my view, this should be taken into account. And indeed, New York State recently raised the age of majority from 16 to 18. And there are people who are saying we should even raise it up to 21. Yeah?
The fact that Mr. Gage's medical history record is so incomplete is just one problem with trying to draw any hard conclusions in this case. Another that applies to all accident victims is how uncontrolled and extensive and non-specific and non-repeatable the damage is. Institutional review boards and then would probably not allow us to perform small controlled lesions on people to see exactly what effect it has.
Well, you could probably do it on residents.
Or I was thinking
Medical residents.
dental students and other
Dental
expendable
students.
populations, yes. But how about, well, has any work of that type been done with non-human primates, say, to try to get the catalog of this bit of brain, take it away, and this is the effect?
That's a great question. I just have no knowledge of it. Yeah, I can't answer.
And of course, other primates don't have the frontal lobes that we use.
You can't, yeah, that's why you gotta be able to do it on people, right? That's why
The practice of lobotomy, I think, would be pretty consistent with that.
Yeah.
So we're on the same page, because it reminds me of the last meetup, when you refer to this informing ethics, are we talking about free will?
That's the big question. Are we a bunch of molecules just banging around, just doing that, or do we have some say in it? And I don't think there's an answer yet. I like to think I have free will, but there's an answer for every particular question that's posed by one side to the other. There's an answer. But yes, that was discussed and was one of the main topics of discussion regarding Gage. To my knowledge, there's no real conclusion that's been reached. And I know Daniel Bennett's done some wonderful work on that case and sort of posits that your mind's function is sort of like the Grand Central Station, where there's a bunch of trains coming in at the same time, and trains of thought, and you can sort of pick from those trains of thought, and that's the closest you can come to free will. But there you go. Yeah.
There's a book called Descartes' Error by, I believe his last name is Damasio, and he begins the book with talking about Phineas Gage, and then he puts a lot more of the book onto a patient of his who had a similar injury, which I'm kind of questioning because you said that the records were so sketchy as to what part of his brain was. I believe it was a viral infection that his patient had, and what he believes is the same area of the brain. And kind of with the goal over here with your sister with from the ER, the rationality he lost, he could still give him logic problems. He could go through those. He would give him situational problems, and he could say, okay, the right thing to do would be this one or that one. What the more rational decision in a particular scenario. However, he would say, I'm not too sure what I would do. And when he was given this very simple tasks like, well, here's a free, we can give you a free gift, a pen or a wallet. And he agonized over this because he didn't have emotional. It's like the frontal lobe was an emotional center that he lost and was unable to basically have any emotions which are necessary to make decisions. Now, I guess my question is twofold here. The author said he was going very far making conclusions here and using Phineas Gage as an example. And it's the whole thing is now the book to me just seems a lot less interesting. It's I was always, this is one of the books on my shelf that I want to go back to read that. And now I sort of think that, maybe this author really took a lot more liberties with this than maybe he should have.
The Demasios actually were one of the groups that helped get a lot of information for that one really crazy graphic that I showed of the brain. And they were sort of positing both the right and left frontal lobes, and there was it ultimately came down to wild speculation, and most neurologists now, as I understand it, are saying, look, enough with this. This was a real curiosity. It kicked off neurology. It was our first understanding of it, but it's not much more than that. We really can't say too much more.
Okay. Have there been observations made since similar to this patient who I believe was a viral infection, like any other brain damage, getting statistics, you lose this area, and say what was the patient's name, HM, who an area around His amygdala, I think, was, his hippocampus was moving, couldn't make memories. Has there been more research like that with the frontal lobe damage?
It's just not my field. I can tell you as a dentist that he lost one of his teeth during this. I can't tell you that much, but,
Only one.
I'll take
only one has.
There must be a huge amount of information from soldiers who've taken bullets in the head.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Right, actually, we're out of time.
Okay, thank you.
So,